I am delighted to be here to join the Marcus Garvey Institute 2020 Conference on the Education of the African Child. My name is Carol Lee, also known as Safisha Matabuti. I'm a professor emeritus at Northwestern University in Chicago, or actually in Evanston, Illinois, and one of the founders of the Institute of Positive Education, New Concept School, Betty Shabazz International Charter Schools that I will talk about as we proceed. And the title of my presentation is Tradition and Reason, Wrestling with Institution Building and Socializing the Next Generation, the African-Centered Problem Space. Lucini Eugene Perkins, Chicago poet and playwright, wrote a poem that's been very widely received called Hey Black Child, Do You Know Who You Are? Do you know who you really are? And we have tried to take up the mantle of that challenge in the work that we've done in Chicago over the last 50 plus years, based on two broad constructs. One, the construct of Ma'at, coming out of ancient Egypt, the proposition that all humans have divinity within them. All humans have perfectibility as possibility. All humans are teachable, and the essentiality of moral social practice in human development. And the complementary construct coming out of South Africa, Ubuntu, the construct of I am because we are. Part of what we wrestle with, I think, as a people on the continent and across the diaspora, but more so in the diaspora, is the way in which we often get caught up in what I call the spider web of the ideology of white supremacy, in some sense picked up by W.E.B. Du Bois in his cautions around what he called double consciousness. And that is to say, there's sets of propositions that are situated in this construct of white supremacy that somehow we feel like we have to always be wrestling against. And one of them, I think, is this whole construct of race. That is the idea of defining people on the basis of skin color. And I want to argue that the construct of race in and of itself is an illogical box, and the terminology in itself inherently supports these theories of white supremacy. We get caught up in using the term, for example, people of color, as though there are human beings who don't have color, because the title of the phrase people of color essentially conveys a notion of there's us and them. There's the colored people, and then there's the human people who don't have color, all of which is patently absurd. And rather, we argue that ethnicity is a more powerful marker of human cultural communities that places us inside of history. Much of what we talk about as a community is the importance of not starting our history with slavery. And that's in part because that whole construct goes back to this illogical construct of race. But ethnicity is what places us in time and space, and it is what surfaces as our way of surviving as a community. And important to understand that people belong to multiple cultural communities, and that cultural communities are not static, but they have regularities as well as change. And trying to understand the multiple cultural communities of which we are all a part, and the ways in which our African communities, both on the continent and across the diaspora, have both continuity and change over time, are part of the issues I'm arguing we wrestle with around this, what I'm calling this problem space of the African-centered problem space. The photo on the slide is one that I show often because this is a young man who has no European ancestry to argue for why he's got blonde hair, for example. He's a Pacific Islander. The continuities that have sustained us as a people, how it is that we have had power and resilience, I'm arguing, as we have done across this conference, come from shared cultural practices that are based on our ethnicity as Pan-African people. Many people may not, well, there's the construct of Sankofa, the idea of the need to look back at one's history in order to understand how to move forward. This importance of understanding and situating ourselves in the continuity of our long history has been long been a powerful sustainer for us as a people. Some of you may or may not know that in New York City, Wall Street was an African burial ground. So in the 16, 17, 1800s, people of African descent who had been enslaved in what we call the African Holocaust of enslavement buried their dead um, in what became Wall Street, quite ironically. The Schomburg Center for Black Culture in New York City some years ago organized protests to get the federal government to establish Wall Street as an African burial ground, a sacred space. As part of that work, they worked with archaeologists from Howard University to dig up remains. They found, as one would expect, that people were in ill health. But what they had not anticipated is that people were buried in positions with markings on the body and in ambulance that indicated, I'm Yoruba, I'm Iwe, I'm Akan. So that people living under circumstances that we cannot even imagine, one, saw and imagined a future in which we would be present and saw the essentiality of naming and understanding who they were. Part of this moving beyond this spider web, as I call it, of white ideology is how we think about the terminology that we use to talk about our experiences. So I do not, for example, use the term slave owner. I use the term people who thought that they owned other human beings because those human beings, our ancestors, never saw themselves as property. There are precedents across much of what I'm going to use as examples will come from U.S. history, but there's certainly parallels really across the globe. But the fact that one of our earliest schools we call the African Free School, the fact that we named one of our major churches the African Methodist Episcopal Church, certainly the Back to Africa movement through Marcus Garvey, but which preceded Marcus Garvey, and Pan-African Congresses, which I'll talk about briefly. Uh, what sustains us across is very powerful that you can go anywhere in the globe where you find a substantial a population of people of African descent, and you will feel commonalities around the notion of connection to ancestors, the idea of extended family network, respect for elders, and certainly the power of the drum and the power of music and the power of rhythm. Some years ago, when my daughter turned 30 and I turned 60, I'm 75 right now, so that was 15 years ago, we went to visit Brazil in Bahia. And we visited a small town where there was an order of Black nuns that had started during the Holocaust of enslavement in Brazil, worked to free Africans from enslavement. And they have a festival they have each year called the Ritual of the Good Death. In the celebration at a very small church, when they finished the celebration, they came out. In the front were a group of young men with djembe drums. After them were these little nuns. There's only a handful of them left, Black nuns left. And after them were some older women who were all dressed in what is essentially sort of traditional Yoruba dress. And they started marching through the town until they get to the center of the town. And then all of a sudden, these young brothers start uh, drumming with the djembe drums, dump to the dump to the lump to the dump. And these older women start, doing the rhythm with the dance. And as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking in my mind, this is New Orleans. How is it that we're finding essentially the same practice in such widespread, distance apart? It is because there's this power of these traditional ways of being in the world that have sustained us clearly as a people. This notion of Sankofa, of looking back at our history to understand how to move forward, is nothing new. We talk about it in terms of the community that's here for this conference, but it's very important to understand. We have David Walker back in 1830 talking about the connection between ancient Egypt and people of Africa. Martin Delany in 1879, George Washington Williams in 1883, Frederick Douglass in 1884. um, that this has been a conscious long-term memory of our people in terms of the power of our connections, our ancestral connections, and that the way in which the people, we go back at the pictures that you see here on the screen, of understanding that these people imagined these people. These are photographs taken by a Black photographer named Polk back in the 1920s, 1930s. And the power of these images, the one on the right, the young men on the automobiles, actually from Chicago, actually neighborhood where I grew up. But they imagined this as a future. And they imagined, because of these people, the picture of the elder man sitting, and you can see from his tattered clothing about his poverty, but what does he have in his hand? He has a book. And we all, of course, know Big Mama. They are why we are here today. We also know from the work of, for example, James Anderson, a historian of education, and the Dean of the School of Education at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, wrote a powerful book called The Education of Blacks in the South, 1860 to 1965, in which he documented in great detail how the very first institutions that Black people established at the end of enslavement in the United States were schools. Over 500 of what would be considered um, Sabbath schools, actually 500 what we would consider like independent schools, similar to the ones I'm going to describe later that we've established here in Chicago, and over 1,500 of what were called Sabbath schools that were established in the South. Vanessa Siddle Walker from Emory University talks about the powerful role that Black schools and Black teachers played in the South in the midst of the Jim Crow era. Again, just part of this sort of ongoing um, power of resistance and self-organization and agency among our people. There's also the powerful history, of course, of the Pan-African congresses from 1901 through 1945. So 6 Pan-African congresses were held. Really important to understand how through the Pan-African congresses, I believe it was the 1945 one, where you have Kwame Nkrumah, George Padmore from the Caribbean, and W.E. Du Bois coming together talking about the, um, the political organizing required to free the countries of Africa from colonial rule. You have the more recent efforts of the Organization of African Unity to establish the sixth region to include the diaspora. Obviously, the Back to Africa movement, leading to the establishment of Freetown, Sierra Leone, and the state of Liberia, and obviously the powerful movement, an example of the Honorable Marcus Garvey, and another even diasporic kind of an example of how in 2003 Brazil voted to include Afro-Brazilian and African history curriculum in all of their schools. At the same time that we talk about our continuities as historically that have sustained us as a people, it's also very important to recognize that we have contestations over these. We're not all on the same page, and that's not a bad thing. I think studying the sort of tensions and debates, for example, between Booker T. Washington and W. Du Bois are very important, because we can't say that there's, for the complexity of the challenges we have, that there's singular sort of right and wrong responses to the challenges that we face as a people. Du Bois raised this challenge, which I call the challenge of tradition and reason. He said it is such incessant self-questioning, this double consciousness that he talked about. and the hesitation that arises from it that is making the present period of time of vacillation and contradiction for the American Negro. Combined race action is stifled, race responsibility is shirked, race enterprise is languished, and the best blood, the best talent, the best energy of the Negro people cannot be marshaled to do the bidding of the race. So, interestingly enough, the challenge that he made so many decades ago, I think is certainly reflective of the challenges that we face today. What I want to spend the remainder of my time talking about is the work that we have done in Chicago in establishing our independent institutions. We have taken the idea that what I have described so far is a long distance run, and that each generation passes on to the next the challenge to take up that baton. What I want to emphasize through the talk is the complexity of taking up that baton, because the conditions that we face from one generation to the next have both similarities and important differences. I want to start with the to talk about the institutions that we've established in Chicago, just as examples of the kind of institution building that I think is absolutely necessary to build each new generation of young people to face and be powerful in the world. So I'm going to start with the Third World Press Foundation, which was established in 1967. It is now 53 years strong and going, founded by Haki R. Madhubuti, my husband, who's a poet, and would like to just mention in this, he's written over 30 books. His most recent book is called Taught by Women. If you go to the Third World Press website, you can get information on that. Third World Press has published the major texts through the Black Power and the Black Arts movement, and going forward, that in every decade of the 5 decades since, the major challenges that we wrestle with as a people, you can find books that have been published by Third World Press to invite our people to interrogate and to think critically about these issues. Among these classic texts, The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. We recently published a book on the Black Panther film called Black Panther, Paradigm Shift or Not. Taking Bullets by my husband, Hakeem Madhubuti, is very classic text examining our political and economic and social challenges and providing vision for how to move forward. And they published a volume called Not Our President, which was one of the first to come out with a critique of Mr. Trump. The authors that have been represented, this is just a handful of them: Malcolm X, John Henry Clark, Amiri Baraka, Jake Carruthers, Gwendolyn Brooks, Asa Hilliard, and you can go on and on, Ossie Davis, have all been published by Third World Press, which is still going strong. We also started the Institute of Positive Education, which began in 1967, I'm sorry, that should be 1969. In 1969, currently the Institute of Positive Education offers an after-school programming, summer programs, Kwanzaa celebrations. The Institute of Positive Education was the first to bring Kwanzaa to Chicago. Dance and drumming showcases, author roundtables, community forums. Over the years, we have had a farm, we had a food co-op, we had Hieroglyphics Inc., where we actually printed did the layout and printing of our own books. Black Books Bulletin, Black Pages, Bethune Teacher Institute. You can see from the picture there how we were recognized by the city by we own a square block in the city of Chicago, and the block on which Ellis Street, that all of our institutions are located, has been renamed in an honorary fashion, the Institute of Positive Education. The pictures you see of our founders, me, my husband Hakeem Madhubuti, Soyini Walton, and our current board chair. What is happening? We also have our school, New Concept School, which was established in 1972. And again, it is continuously in operation since 1972. We service children between the ages of 2 and 5 with a holistic program that integrates both um, cultural, developing a strong cultural identity as very young children with strong academic programming as well. We also then, we decided in 1998, after having had New Concept School running as both an early childhood and an elementary program, we decided to um, transfer the elementary program into a charter school. We did that because we said that the charter school was public funds. This would allow us to offer our programming free of charge to more children than we could when we charged even a minimal tuition. We named our schools after Betty Shabazz, the wife of Malcolm X, El Haj Malik El Shabazz, in part because she was a very dear friend to our family and to our institution, and was a very powerful image of everything that we wanted our children to become. Betty Shabazz International Charter Schools were established in 1998. We currently serve close to 500 children on 2 campuses. We are an African-centered school. In our school, our teachers are called mamas and babas. The idea of it takes a village to raise a child, and we integrate African and African American culture throughout our curriculum with a focus on the holistic development of young people. When we say that it takes a village to raise a child, I want to just point out some examples from the photographs that you see. In the upper column of the gentleman holding the little girl who started off at New Concept and then went into Betty Shabazz, currently has a PhD in engineering and is working in California. The young man in the picture under beneath there, where his mother is holding him, is currently heading up a community-based not-for-profit called Real Men Cook. The, the family that you see in the picture, the man and the woman together there, again, these are people who have been with us for 20, 30 years. Their children currently work in the school. Their son is a teacher assistant at Betty Shabazz, and their daughter, who's a professional musician, teaches music in the school. So the idea here really is what we've been able to do because of the length here is to really build intergenerational competence in carrying out the work of these institutions. We see ourselves as a diasporic people, understanding that we want our children to understand that they are part of the world. And so we have sent children to the continent on a number of occasions. Our kids have worked to support access to clean water in a village in Ghana. The photograph that you see there is of some colleagues from Maori colleagues from New Zealand who were visiting the school. We have a heavy emphasis in the school on health and Kujichagulia, self-determination, the notion of growing, for example, growing your own foods, so that kids are engaged in urban gardening. We have rooftop gardening. We have gardens in the back of the school. We have solar roof panels. Um, and all of this kind of work is also integrated in terms of the curriculum work that the children are involved in. We have partners in a number of community partners that we work with in this work on urban gardening. We are nationally recognized for serving vegetarian lunches in our school, and um, our children have come to love what's required for healthy living and healthy eating. We've studied this work and have come to been able to document all that the children have learned about health and their own well-being, and sort of changing practices, often even practices even with their family, by virtue of this work. Our Sizemore campus, CPS, Chicago Public Schools, attempted to close it unsuccessfully in 1916. So Sizemore is still running, but a filmmaker, David Steiner, came to visit and volunteered to organize our children in developing a film to document what was going on, calling Saving Barbara Sizemore. The children did the filming, they photographed in the community, they edited, they storyboarded, they met with news media to talk about the work, and their film was shown all across the country, including in Uganda, East Africa. We have a strong cultural socialization program, African drumming, African dance, integrated with sports, capoeira, drum corps, etc. And so from this holistic work, what I want to conclude is with some brief discussion of what I think are the important lessons that we have learned over these 50 years in trying to build these institutions. We think about this, as I said earlier, as engaged in a long distance run across the generation, with each generation having the responsibility to build the social networks, the human capital, and the institutions to sustain our people across time and space. But as Maulana Karenga, who will be, I think, presenting at the conference, raised this question of what he called the relationship between tradition and reason. On the one hand, it is absolutely essential that we understand and pass on all the important lessons that we have learned from our history, but at the same time to wrestle with new challenges that emerge that have to be wrestled with in complex ways. So these are what I'm suggesting are the things that we've learned over the last 50 years that are crucial in building institutions in the spirit of tradition and reason. One is creating internal culture that allows for ongoing reflection, having realistic evaluation of the needs of our communities. I've often said that I take Asa Hilliard's experience as an example of this conundrum, that on the one hand, that Asa did such a powerful work across his life in keeping alive the importance of our knowledge and traditions and what that meant for socializing our children. And yet he ends up in Ghana not taking his malaria pill and dying. And that's, for me, is part of the sort of conundrum of complexities of trying to understand how we still wrestle with such significant poverty for our people really across the globe, and understanding at the level of the neighborhood in terms of like a locale for us in Chicago, but also nationally across the diaspora and internationally. What it means to create a culture of shared decision making in our organizations. We have lots of issues around sort of cults of leadership in organizations that we've had historically. Personally, I don't think work in our favor. I have often said, people may disagree with me on this, that I'm not a fan of kings and queens, and I don't wish to be, brought into that, because I think we need democratic shared decision making, but that's difficult to organize and sustain. The need to create technical infrastructure to sustain development. This has been so important to us over the 50 years. If we have not had over these 50 years people with strong expertise in economics, expertise in business and organizational management, in communication and public relations, and the whole issue of how we build human capacity has been a tremendous struggle for us over the 50 years. And I would argue is that this kind of infrastructure has often been what makes or breaks institutions being able to sustain themselves over time. Building intergenerational transmission of leadership is tremendously important. This is why when I talked about some of the people who've come through our schools who are currently working and have leadership roles in our schools, has been again an important challenge that we have wrestled with. And as a diasporic people, building institutional alliances across spaces and building transnational human capital. We need to go back to our Pan-African Congresses and begin to bring together expertise from the Caribbean, from Central and South America, from the North America, from the continent, from our people dispersed across Europe and other places in the world, to try to come up with plans for building the kind of capacity we need to wrestle with the challenges that we face as a people. Mary McLeod Bethune um, gave us this challenge in her last will and testimony, where she said, we're the custodians as well as the heirs of a great civilization. And we have tried in the work that we have done in Chicago over these last 50 plus years to pass this baton on. The photograph that you see here are of young people who have graduated from New Concept School or from Betty Shabazz over these past 40 some odd years. And when we look at the one is that they are still a community. They stay connected or with one another, even as adults and parents as they are. When we look at the kind of work that they have done in the world, they're teachers and engineers and entrepreneurs and artists and accountants and lawyers and people working in communications and people running not-for-profits and in real estate and across all the professions, but in all of those cases, dedicated to doing good in the world, of loving Black people, and building strong community. I'd like to close then um, with one, if I can, let's see, do this um, very quickly to just show you some photographs of the work that we have done. This is a magazine we put out called Sankofa. Um, these are children working what we call our maker space in terms of building science and technology. Um, Again, photographs of our urban gardening. This is all created and sustained by children in the school. The healthy lunches that they love, our award-winning uh, chefs in the vegetarian work. This young lady was an eighth grader who had a perfect score on the exam she needed to go into selective enrollment high school. We have a male mentoring program that we collaborate with Chicago State University, working with our young men, and we're expanding that now to include young women. As we said, we have a very strong art programming in terms of our school and music. This young lady here, who is one of our ancestors now, who actually taught in high school, Mama Ann Ward, but we have now named our arts program after her, Ann Ward Super Arts Project, but she had been with us at least several decades. Again, I had shown you something about the film that the children made. This young man is also now one of our recent ancestors, but he graduated from Betty Shabazz, and his family um, helped us get funding to support what we call Ajibawo's Makerspace. Again, he lives on through the work of the Makerspace. And then, of course, we data on our children getting into selective enrollment high schools. Um, the academics in their science fair, they actually talk in the press conferences, in the media, the wax museum they do every February, um, working with community resources and community mentors to support, again, holistic development, our sports programming, and finally, our alumni, this young man who's a member of Alvin Ailey Theater, came out of Betty Shabazz. Um, Desmond Owusu, who's published in a scientific journal. Ade Bowden, who's a dentist. This young lady from AT&T in North Carolina, AT&T scholar. This young lady doing work in Korea right now. Again, children seeing themselves as part of the world. This young lady at Harvard Law School, Shani Crow, who is become this international artist of really some renown, IBM programmer, etc. So the idea again here, this is the young lady I talked about, her parents who've been with us for decades, went to the school, is a professional musician, is now teaching music. So the point um, simply is to try to share with you what we have tried to do over these last 5 decades, hopefully as a model of entrepreneurship and self-determination, building new generations, and at the same time to share in my closing about the complexities of trying to do this and sustain this over time. With that, I thank you and look forward to discussion.